Picture this, it's 1956. An absolutely vastly outnumbered rebellion is about to take on a fully entrenched, heavily armed national military. Today in this explainer, we're dissecting the anatomy of a truly impossible victory. We're going to look closely at the historical accounts of how guerrilla warfare was successfully utilized to defeat a dictator in Cuba, and how those exact same tactics were later exported abroad. The source material we're digging into breaks down the intricate hit-and-run strategies of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. So let's dive right in and see how this unbelievable David and Goliath scenario actually unfolded.
I mean, just consider the sheer impossibility of these numbers for a second. You have 80 exiled men packing themselves onto a single small boat, attempting to overthrow Fulgencio Batista. Now, at the time, Batista was a dictator leading a massive US-backed government in Cuba. To openly plot against him inside the country, that basically meant inviting a fake encounter and certain death. The accounts really emphasize just how wildly outmatched these 80 men were. This wasn't just a battle of numbers, it was a battle for pure survival against an entire national army.
Section 1. The Blueprint of Rebellion. Planning in Mexico. Because they obviously couldn't plan in Cuba, the initial preparation had to happen elsewhere. In 1955, Fidel Castro left his life as a lawyer in Cuba and traveled to Mexico. And this wasn't some reckless spur-of-the-moment charge. As the source details, this was a highly calculated military operation fueled by intense study. Fidel's brother, Raul Castro, had actually gone ahead and met an Argentine doctor who was highly anti-US, Che Guevara. When Fidel finally arrived, those two had an all-night meeting that literally laid the blueprint for their rebellion using guerrilla warfare tactics.
But what's really fascinating here is this specific condition Che set during that all-night meeting. He looked at Castro and told him, "I will fight for Cuba, but once it is free, I will leave to start revolutions elsewhere." He flat out demanded that Castro not stop him once the time came, and Fidel agreed. Keep this strict condition in mind because it brilliantly foreshadows Che's international campaigns and the global impact of these tactics that we're going to see a bit later.
Okay, so to make this totally impossible blueprint a reality, they needed a true expert. So they hired a man named Alberto Bayo, an absolute master of guerrilla tactics. Bayo trained Castro's army deep in the forests of Mexico. They were out there mastering these hit-and-run maneuvers long before ever setting foot in Cuba. And the historical notes here are just wild. Che Guevara was suffering from such severe childhood asthma during this training that his body would literally turn blue from a lack of oxygen. People were telling Castro to leave him behind, saying he'd slow the whole unit down. Castro's response? He flat out refused. He said he would carry Che on his back up the mountains himself if he had to.
Section 2. Survival in the Mountains. The Sierra Maestra Retreat. That unwavering loyalty was put to the test immediately. On November 25, 1956, the 80 men left Mexico for Cuba. But man, the landing was disastrous. Batista's forces actually had prior intelligence about their landing spot at Alegria de Pio. So Batista unleashes his army and air force, just decimating the rebels from the air and the ground. Che was shot and critically wounded, and he only survived because another member carried him out. The battered survivors had absolutely no choice but to flee deep into the harsh Sierra Maestra mountains.
Retreating to the Sierra Maestra wasn't just about hiding, though. It became the ultimate real-world test of the tactics Alberto Bayo had taught them. The key takeaway here is that guerrilla warfare doesn't aim to overpower the guy in front of you. It aims to outlast him. By blending into that incredibly harsh mountain terrain, they kicked off a grueling 2-year campaign of hit-and-run tactics against Batista's numerically superior army. The whole goal? To exhaust and bleed the enemy. And you know what? It worked. By 1958, these exact tactics had resulted in the deaths of thousands of Batista soldiers and forced a ton of others to just surrender.
Section 3. The Santa Clara Masterstroke, a strategic gamble. Moving into 1958, Castro makes this incredible, game-changing decision. He sends Che Guevara and a force of around 400 men to capture the city of Santa Clara. Now, why Santa Clara? Well, it was a critical hub for Cuba's supply routes. Castro knew that if they could take this city, Batista's entire supply chain would be completely choked off. It was a massive, dangerous gamble, for sure, but a strategic maneuver they basically had to take to end the war.
So, how exactly do 400 men take an entire city from a national army? The methodology here was brilliantly precise. Step 1. Che's forces secretly capture a high building so they can track every single movement of Batista's army. Step 2, they literally cut the telegraph and telephone wires, completely isolating Santa Clara from the capital, Havana. Hearing all this chaos, Batista panics and dispatches a heavily armed train loaded with weapons to reinforce his troops. But Che's underground network knew it was coming on December 29th. So, step 3, they uproot the train tracks. Actually, scratch that, they use bulldozers to completely destroy the tracks, setting the stage perfectly for step 4, the ambush.
Boom! At around 3 p.m. on December 29th, the trap is sprung. The train hits the destroyed tracks and instantly derails. We are talking total chaos here. 22 train cars violently stacked on top of one another. The rebels immediately swarm the wreckage, capture the surviving soldiers, and seize this massive stockpile of weapons. In a matter of minutes, the rebels achieved a tactical victory that entirely broke the back of Batista's military logistics.
Section 4. Winning the psychological war, breaking morale. You see, defeating Batista wasn't just about firepower and stealing weapons. This revolution was equally about destroying Batista's propaganda machine and breaking the National Army's morale. They knew they had to win the psychological war if they wanted to win the country. For years, Batista's propaganda had convinced his army that the rebels were these ruthless killers who would execute any prisoners on sight. But look at what actually happened after that devastating train derailment. Instead of executing the captured soldiers, Che took the wounded enemy combatants to the local hospital and ensured they received medical treatment. It was a move that completely shattered Batista's narrative. That message spread like wildfire through the ranks. Suddenly, the army realized the rebels were friends of the Cuban people, not enemies. This is such a prime example of how neutralizing an enemy's will to fight is just as effective as neutralizing their actual weapons. This psychological masterstroke completely dissolved whatever will to fight Batista's army had left. When Batista realized Che had taken Santa Clara and that his forces' morale had totally evaporated, he knew it was over. Absolute defeat. On January 1, 1959, just days later, Batista packed up his gold, hopped on a plane, and fled to the Dominican Republic. Castro came down from the mountains and took the presidency.
Section 5. The Bolivian Betrayal. Che's final mission. Alright, remember that strict condition Che set back in Mexico? Fast forward to 1965, and that revolutionary impulse in Che woke up again. Fulfilling his promise, he left Cuba, and Castro, honoring his word, let him go. He equipped Che with seasoned guerrilla fighters and advanced weapons, telling him the doors of Cuba would always be open if he needed to come back. Let's trace where these tactics went next.
Tracking his route based on the source material, Che first goes to the Congo in 1965, then Tanzania, and by November 1966, he arrives in Bolivia. However, Che was fiercely anti-US, and the US government gave the CIA a free hand to stop him. The CIA quickly established a network of local peasant informants in Bolivia, and unfortunately for Che, one of those informants, a man named Honorado Rojas, betrayed his location. He told the CIA exactly where the bearded men were hiding out in the jungle. The forces surrounded the area, and they captured Che Guevara alive. The historical facts reported in the sources present a pretty grim end here. The CIA and Bolivian officials were terrified that bringing Che to the US for a trial would spark this massive global spectacle, a total uproar. So, to prevent that, the Bolivian president ordered his execution the very next day. Che was shot with 9 bullets. And to prevent identification and hide what really happened, authorities severed his hands and crafted a completely false public narrative claiming he was killed in combat and that his body had been burned. Section 6, a 30-year mission. Castro's revenge. When the news of Che's brutal death finally reached Fidel Castro, it absolutely shook him to the core. He immediately declared 3 days of national mourning, lowering all flags to half-mast. But mourning very quickly turned into action. Castro launched a relentless, highly classified intelligence operation through his G2 agency. The sole goal? To avenge Che and bring his body home, no matter how long it took. And the sheer, ruthless efficiency of Cuba's G2 agents is honestly astounding. Castro gave them a hit list. First, they tracked down Roberto Quintanilla, the Bolivian intelligence officer who ordered Che's hands cut off, and assassinated him in broad daylight in Germany. Then, they found and eliminated the informant, Honorado Rojas. But perhaps most incredibly, Castro deployed G2 sleeper agents deep into Bolivia. These guys literally embedded themselves as businessmen, doctors, and local workers for 25 to 30 years. They were patiently waiting for the military eyewitnesses of Che's execution to retire so they wouldn't be too afraid to speak up. Talk about playing the long game. A massive breakthrough in this decades-long mission actually happened pretty early on, around 1968. Antonio Argudas, a Bolivian minister who heavily resented CIA interference in his country, made a shocking move. Out of pure respect for Che, he secretly sent a package to Cuba. Inside was a jar filled with formalin, containing Che Guevara's actual preserved hands, along with his diary. Arguedas even gave interviews in London and Chile, dropping a massive hint to the world. Che's body was never burned, it was secretly buried.
Those decades of waiting finally paid off in 1995. A Bolivian general slipped up in an interview, casually mentioning the Valle Grande airport. Castro immediately activated his undercover network. They took 1967 photographs of the area, cross-referenced them with modern satellite imagery, and looked for disturbed soil. On June 28, 1997, after highly targeted excavations, they finally located a mass grave holding 7 skeletons. One of them was entirely missing its hands. After 30 years, the search was over.
The decades-long search concluded with a profoundly emotional return. A special military plane brought the remains to José Martí Airport in Havana, where Fidel Castro personally received the coffin, silently bowing his head. He had issued a strict order to the public and officials: absolutely no crying. He turned the return into this massive historical event, driving the coffin through crowds of millions on a military jeep. Che was finally laid to rest, coming full circle back to Santa Clara, the very city his guerrilla tactics had captured to win the revolution. Castro personally lit an eternal flame at his memorial, which still burns to this day.
Which brings us to a really fascinating final thought. We've seen how meticulously Che and Fidel applied guerrilla warfare to achieve a totally impossible victory in Cuba, outlasting and toppling a dictator. Yet, when Che tried to export those exact same tactics to Bolivia, it resulted in betrayal and his execution. So why did the environment, the local population, and the intelligence network respond so differently? It really makes you ponder the limits of asymmetric warfare and how deeply local context dictates military success. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this breakdown gives you a new perspective on the complex mechanics behind these massive historical events.